We would like to begin today by recognizing and acknowledging that we are on the lands of Peoria, Kaskaskia, Piankashaw, Wea, Miami, Muscooten, Odawa, Sauk, Meskwaki, Kickapoo, Potawatomi, Ojibwe, and Chickasaw nations. These lands were the traditional territory of these Native nations prior to their forced removal. These lands continue to carry the stories of these nations and their struggles for survival and identity. As a land-grant institution, the University of Illinois has a particular responsibility to acknowledge the peoples of these lands, as well as the histories of dispossession that have allowed for the growth of this institution for the past 150 years. We are also obligated to reflect on and actively address these histories and the role that this university has played in shaping them. This acknowledgement and the centering of Native peoples is a start as we move forward for the next 150 years. Welcome. This semester, the university-wide is excited to be partnering with the Diversity Ed for the entire Friday Forum and Conversation Cafe Fall 2021 semester-long series, Unpacking Racism, What Are We Carrying? Just some quick announcements. Diversity Ed asks you to join us next Thursday evening, October 28th, from 7 to 8 p.m. in the Psychology Building, room 32, for our iJourney workshop entitled Culture, Not Costume. The university-wide Fred S. Bailey Scholarship Program provides over $200,000 in monetary support to U of I students. There are 4 different scholarships within the Bailey Scholarship Program, and applications are open. For more information, check out our website or reach out to our student director, Akria, here at the Y. Join us here again next week at the same time and place for our Friday Forum and Conversation Cafe with Catherine Shee, an anti-hate training coordinator for the Asian Americans Advancing Justice in Chicago.
We want to continue thanking our sponsors that make this series possible. They are as follows: the Student Cultural Programming Fee, which is providing lunch weekly. We are grateful for them. The Social Action Committee of the Unitarian Universalist Church of Urbana-Champaign, Women in Gender and Global Perspectives Program, Humanities Research Institute, LGBT Resource Center, Women's Resources Center, Education Justice Project, Department of Urban and Regional Planning, Office of the Provost, the Center for Global Studies, First Mennonite Church of Urbana-Champaign, Center for Advanced Study, Latino Studies, Illini Hillel, College of Fine and Applied Arts, and more. Thank you so much. I'm happy to introduce our incredible speaker today, Caitlin Reedy-Rogier, who will be presenting Moving Upstream, an Anti-Racist Approach to Healthcare Education. Following her talk, there will be a few minutes for Q&A, and if you're online, please submit your questions via the chat and we will retrieve them from there. And if you're in person, there should be a question card on your seat, and you can go ahead and jot down your questions as she's speaking, and I will periodically move through the room and collect those for her to answer following her talk. Caitlin is a social worker living and working in St. Louis with her partner, 2 boys, ages 5 and 2, and her 2 corgis. Her work centers around fostering compassion in our future physician workforce by implementing a health equity and justice curriculum across 2 medical education institutions in St. Louis. She combines her passion for anti-racism work, a desire for a more equitable healthcare, and her love for teaching and facilitating challenging conversations toward the end of institutional and systemic culture change. In her spare time, she can be found on her moped, driving around St. Louis, or wrangling the aforementioned creatures that lives in her house. I would like to welcome Caitlin to the podium to proceed with her talk.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for coming today. So today I'm really going to talk through one approach that we've taken to really thinking about how to address racism in healthcare. This is a really pervasive problem. We know that we have really terrible outcomes for folks who are minoritized in our communities as it relates to healthcare. Healthcare is often a source of major trauma. And so how do we start to undo some of that, unpack that, move upstream to get to folks before they ever enter the physician workforce? So, I want to give some context for where this all started. in May of 2018, Washington University in St. Louis started undergoing curriculum renewal. I had started my job at the Integrated Health Network, which is not affiliated with the university, but my job at the IHN was really to help our med schools build out equity in their curriculum. When I came on in January of 2018, nobody had any idea what that was going to look like. No clue how that was going to work. We just knew that it was something that needed to happen. I started January 2nd, and I was told by my boss, hey, starting January 18th, you have a class that you're going to teach for SLU and WashU around trauma-informed care. I was like, has this been built out? And they said, nope, you get to design that and do it. Cool. So I did that, and I started sort of getting to know these institutions. And in May, WashU had this sort of curriculum retreat where they started talking about what it would mean to envision a new curriculum. So that happened for about 2 years that renewal process happened. There was lots of meetings. And then there was, you may have heard, a global pandemic. That pandemic sort of changed the way that we thought about how we could roll out a curriculum, right? We had been planning more traditional models of in-person teaching, lectures, those kinds of things. And we suddenly had to shift about 6 months before we were going to roll out the curriculum. In June of 2020, George Floyd was murdered. And St. Louis and Washington University in particular is about 10 miles from where Michael Brown was murdered. So that hit us pretty hard, right? We had been contending with the murder of Michael Brown for, at this point, 6 years. And now we had this other sort of national narrative that we are having to confront. There was a new chancellor that came into the university, and he sort of gave an inaugural address that said, we are going to move WashU to an institution that was in St. Louis, for St. Louis and with St. Louis. And so we really took that to heart in thinking about what that might mean. Nationally, there were many conversations happening around what equity in healthcare might look like. The YMCA started a Center for Health Equity that they were thinking about, how do we think about medical education? And ultimately, right, there's been historical structural exclusion of underrepresented in medicine folks. And so we wanted to sort of shed a spotlight on that. We know that discordant physician-patient identities, so having a white provider with a patient of color, actually yields worse health outcomes when there are concordant identities. So in keeping all of this in mind, we were really thinking about what would it mean to create an anti-racism curriculum in healthcare. And ultimately, we've settled on these 3 pillars, which I will walk through one by one, but really thinking about structural competency, community engagement that sort of leans into Chancellor Martin's in St. Louis, for St. Louis, with St. Louis, and then being very explicit about what it means to be anti-racist, particularly what it means to be an anti-racist physician. So structural competency really says we have these things that exist around us, these structures, these policies. Those lead to individual circumstances that are what we often refer to as the social determinants of health, right? How you navigate systems, what your access looks like, what maybe your educational opportunities are. And all of that combined leads to health outcomes, right? So if you have social determinants of health that are facilitators of health, right? You have access to healthcare, you have a good educational system, you have no struggles with transportation, your health outcomes are going to be better. If you have poor or barriers in social determinants of health, your outcomes will be worse. And what we're asking our students, or our med students, to do is to understand this and recognize your role in it, to exercise structural competency, that you're not just looking at symptoms and creating diagnoses in a vacuum, but rather you need to understand both the social determinants of health, but also how those social determinants of health are dictated by policies and economic systems and our systems of racism, sexism, et cetera. So this is a term that was coined by Jonathan Metzl and Helena Hansen in 2014. didn't gain a lot of traction right away, but it's starting to pick up steam now. And I think it's because we're starting to see this uptick in more and more conversations about racism and sexism, poverty, and those impacts on health outcomes. And ultimately, what structural competency does is it provides these sort of tangible ways that we can interact with social and structural determinants of health. On the surface, those things are very hard to understand, right? That, yes, I get that transportation issues can cause issues for my patients, but what am I supposed to do about that, right? I don't understand how we got to that place in the first place, right? What created this? Why in St. Louis, if you're at all familiar with the infrastructure, you might know that we have a Metrolink. That Metrolink goes in a straight line from Illinois to the airport. It is a straight line through the middle of the city. It does not go north or south. So if you live anywhere off of that line, your public transportation access is greatly minimized. So really this is, how do we start to create ties with these social structural determinants of health into our clinical interactions? How do we take those into consideration? And what does it mean to practice through a structural competency lens? This requires really explicit and intentional conversations about our social and structural determinants of health in ways that are not just done in passing. It means we have entire sessions dedicated to those things. So then we talk about community engagement, which leans into structural competency because you have to understand what's happening in our communities. But really talking about how we create partnerships and coalitions and how we use those partnerships and coalitions to create change for policies, programs, and practices. This is something that I think a lot of people take for granted, right? We do a lot of community service, we do a lot of volunteering, but how much of that is actually in true collaboration? This is another thing that we're really pushing our students towards. And we lean into this spectrum. And what I will say about this is, our students are at a 4-year medical school. Med school is, I'm told, no joke. I've never been to med school. I like to say that I'm auditing it currently. But we understand that their role is as a student first. And we want to make sure that they recognize that there are limitations to their roles. We also tend to have overachieving students. And so we really say, we don't expect you to get beyond outreach or consult, right? We don't actually expect you to get to a point of shared leadership while you're in school. And if you start to think about what intentionality you would need to use to get to shared leadership, it's really important to take that into consideration. So we historically have had a problem in St. Louis with our students dropping into communities saying like, hey, I know it's wrong here. I'm gonna fix it, and then I'm gonna bounce, right? This happens a lot with a lot of students because students rotate through, right? I was a student. I was here at the University of Illinois. I did that. It's really nice to hear some of the things that I did continue on. I was one of the first facilitators for the iJourney workshops. But ultimately, right, this is what we really expect our students to do, is to lean into needs that are identified by the community itself, right? To not go in and think that you know best after you've been here for 3 months, but really make sure that we understand what's happening. Because of those previous unstable relationships, there's been a lot of harm that's been done to our community. And so we really actually ask them to lean into restorative justice principles by acknowledging those previous harms and then allowing the community to drive what that relationship looks like. Ultimately, we're asking our students to be consistent, to think about sustainability, and to be predictable in the ways that you show up in community. So then we have sort of our anti-racism approach. And this is by far the piece that is both the meat, I think, of our health equity and justice curriculum, but is also the hardest to think through. So we think of anti-racism as this form of action, and that it requires conscious efforts and actions to provide those equitable opportunities. We lean into Ivermec's Kindi around this, that not being racist is not the same thing as being anti-racist, right? And so we're very much pushing our students beyond the do no harm, but in fact, we would like you to do good, right? That we would like you to act in ways that are actively anti-racist. This is challenging because we have students coming from all walks of life. We have students that are coming from multiple perspectives and multiple life experiences themselves. And so we're asking them to lean into this process, knowing that for us, we can't drive that for them. So one of the things that we do in our structured curriculum is that, similarly to the community engagement piece, it's really important for us to acknowledge the previous harms that have been done by our institution. So we do a timeline of desegregation for Washington University. Excuse me. And in that timeline, one of the dates that we have is in 2018, when that was the year that there was a sign in the basement of the hospital that WashU is attached to that talked about treating Black women. Black women gave birth in the basement of Barnes Hospital. And 2018 is when the sign was removed for that. Now, Black women weren't being treated in the basement any longer, but that sign was a signpost for how racism continues to exist in our community. We also know that beyond our institution, that structural and systemic racism exists in healthcare, and so we have to acknowledge this for our students. And we'll talk a little bit more about what that looks like, but really asking them to unpack how you see racism showing up in our community and how you see racism showing up when you're in the clinic. Trauma-informed care is another sort of buzzword that is picking up traction in our healthcare settings. These tenets here, safety, trustworthiness, collaboration, empowerment, and choice, are all the tenets of trauma-informed care. Within the curriculum renewal, we asked our clinical skills folks, not me, to build trauma-informed care into all of their clinical skills. How do we interact with patients in a way that is trauma-informed? And in that trauma-informed paradigm, we acknowledge that systemic racism is trauma. Ultimately thinking about equity at the center. So I can't give you a checklist that says if you do X, Y, and Z, you will be trauma-informed, because we have to take all of our patient experiences into consideration in a unique way. And then finally, we do a lot of personal and professional identity formation. Sometimes this looks like having our students go into our federally qualified health centers, understand how those centers are funded and what those providers working in those spaces work with on a regular basis. Sometimes it looks like going into our well-resourced hospital system and comparing providers and saying, I want to do this or I do not want to do this. Our personal identity formation is asking them to think about, what is your racial identity formation? How have you been socialized around race? What does that mean for you? How does that show up in your interactions with your colleagues and your patients? And how can you work to mitigate your bias? All of this only works if it is integrated. So I am the co-lead for our health equity and justice curriculum. I meet with our students on a weekly basis. We have protected time once a week. I'm an MSW, as was mentioned, which means I am not an MD. My co-lead for health equity and justice has her MPH. She's a public health practitioner, also not an MD. We have much less legitimacy within our med school curriculum than our MD colleagues who are teaching our med students. So what this requires is that those MDs who are also faculty are teaching similar content, right? They're working on integrating it in. So we ask them, how are you incorporating social and structural determinants of health when you're talking about diabetes, when you're talking about kidney failure? Are you using race as a social construct or as an essential part of someone's biology? A tenet of our curriculum is that race is a social construct. If that is the case, we cannot say that race is a risk factor. Instead, we need to frame this out as racism is a risk factor. How does racism impact the way that these disease statuses show up for folks? And then starting to acknowledge, where does racism still exist and embedded and coded into our healthcare system? we still have race corrections in our healthcare system. One of those examples is EGFR. Those of you who are not in healthcare settings, I was there. This is the calculation for kidney function. This is a calculation that determines whether or not someone qualifies for dialysis. There is a Black and non-Black calculation for EGFR. If race is a social construct, how can we possibly have a Black calculation? So this asks us to move from race-based medicine, this thing that thinks about race as an essential factor, something that impacts someone's biology, to race-conscious medicine, understanding that while race is a social construct, the lived reality of race is very real. The impacts of race are very real. So we can't ignore race altogether in healthcare, but what we can do is be very conscious about the ways that it plays out and make sure that it is not having unnecessary ramifications for how we practice medicine. And as I mentioned, really thinking about trauma-informed care in those clinical skills spaces, which also acknowledges racism and sexism in clinical interaction. So we can do all of this in the vacuum of the hour and a half that I have control over every week, right? I can say these things to my students. I can even get our faculty on board that teach their basic science and foundational knowledge portions of their curriculum. But it means nothing if our entire institution is not along for the ride, right? Washington University is certainly an institution steeped in white supremacy. And so how do we start to unpack a lot of that harm that's been done? How do we start to move the institution towards this transformational change? And what does that mean? So one of the ways that this is happening, and it's really exciting that it's happening, is a program that we're building and rolling out called Understanding Systemic Racism. This is a multi-level approach to culture change. And what we've done is we've identified champions in multiple departments who are identified as equity champions. Those folks go through essentially the same curriculum that I'm rolling out for the med students, the mirrored curriculum, where we do the same sort of approach, right? How do you understand your personal identity formation? How does that impact your professional identity, how you show up in these spaces? How do you understand our institutional history and its impacts in our community at large? And how do you understand the impact of racism in healthcare in the setting that you exist in and work in? It's a parallel process. This is helpful because for our students, they're seeing a lot of sort of cognitive, or experiencing rather, a lot of cognitive dissonance, right? I'm teaching them this curriculum in a classroom setting. They're going into clinical settings, and basically everything I've said has gone out the window, right? Because our system is still steeped in racism. So we're doing a sort of parallel process, inviting these practitioners along for the ride and getting them to experience the same things actually that our students are, right? Experiencing the same kind of cognitive dissonance, but perhaps with a better understanding of the system as a whole. And then ultimately we've got some institutional awareness and commitment. So the School of Medicine put out a statement about systemic racism. And it's a statement that said those things around race as a social construct, that racism is inherent in our system. So they put this out as a statement from our school. They also put forward sort of an accountability statement, which was really important, and it was something that I actually pushed really hard for, because I think it's really easy for institutions to put out statements of support around anti-racism efforts. It's really easy for institutions to put out diversity statements. But if there's no sense of accountability, there's nothing we can do about it, right? So this accountability statement said something like, we are committing funds to reducing debt for our BIPOC students, which they have done. We're putting resource towards the Understanding Systemic Racism approach, which they've done. So for those equity champions who are part of that cohorts, those cohorts of folks embedded within the departments, we actually have protected time. So they're not having to do this on top of their job. Accountability is really important in anti-racism work. It's something that I think we often overlook in spaces like this. So one of the things that we actually have our students do at the end of their preclinical education, we have them craft an accountability statement for how they plan to act on anti-racism work as they move into clinical spaces. So creating this accountability for our institution is another way that we've sort of shifted this towards an anti-racist institution. So this leads us to what's next. So this curriculum that has been built has almost finished its first iteration. We have approximately 4 more weeks, I think. So we've also started the second iteration. So there's some overlap there. We're looking into their clerkship years. So how are we going to continue this work, building out this professional identity formation as they enter clinical spaces? And then we have these things, there's advanced clinical rotations, and how do we continue to build that out there? Work on refining the curriculum. Often our institutions of higher education like to lean into expert language. So I often get identified as an expert in health equity or an expert in anti-racism work, and I always push back. I'm not an expert, I'm simply someone who is not afraid to ask questions and to say things out loud. And what this means is that we go back through this curriculum and go like, man, we really messed that up. Or that is not where that was supposed to be. Or we need to take a different approach on this. So we're working on refining that curriculum. And then finally, increasing the bandwidth. So we talked about those equity champions, but ultimately there are 2 of us at an institution that employs approximately 6,000 people, trying to sort of do this work in educational spaces. So really working on how do we increase that bandwidth, and what does that mean? The limitations here are endless, right? Time is always a limitation. As I mentioned, I have an hour and a half. An hour and a half when discussing things like systemic racism is almost nothing at all. And ultimately, right, my bandwidth is limited. So this work is emotionally taxing. As a white woman, right, I show up in these spaces in a very interesting way. And even at that, right, I have a family, I have things that happen outside of this. So how do we continue the conversation in a way that is sustainable? So we'll continue to do the work, we'll continue to push into new spaces, but ultimately we're doing really solid work. So with that, I will take questions.
So I just went around for the first round and grabbed some questions. If you have another one, feel free to write it and I'll come around again.
All right, we've got some really great questions here. So I'm going to start with the ones that are much more tied to sort of the talk that I did. And then there are some that are sort of broader, which are really great. So one is around the accountability statements, particularly with BIPOC students. And this is a really interesting question because certainly accountability looks different for folks who are not white. I think it's easy to imagine what white folks are accountable to in this. But what we really lean into for students of color are really thinking about how do we understand internalized racism and what does it mean to unpack some of that work. And then accountability around continuing to grow in racial identity in sort of healthy ways to start to think through how do we undo how we've been socialized around race and racism. So when we do our exercise around socialization and race. We talk a lot about how we all are breathing the same air, right? Doesn't matter what the color of your skin is, we all breathe the same air. And so accountability for folks of color are often really thinking about is there different air that I can find and breathe? And what would it look like for me to do that and to push other BIPOC folks to do that? There's maybe one example of what that might look like in those spaces. Other accountability statements I've seen are sort of accountability to heal and to do the work to heal. And that comes up a lot in those statements. So that is the answer there. So there's a question about how can students flex to hold institutions accountable to their diversity statement? That's such a great question. And it's something that we actually come up against a lot because particularly, I think this is the case everywhere, although I think in some institutions it's less acute. But in medical institutions in particular, medicine is such a hierarchical space, right? Your ability to match to a residency often depends on the rapport that you've developed with your attending while in med school, right? These people that grade you are often the same people that are writing you letters of recommendation, may also be program directors for programs you might want to get into. So it gets really complicated really fast. And so one of the things that we really push students towards is thinking about what is the level at which you can intervene. So maybe it's not holding the institution itself accountable, but thinking about how that plays out for you and your students. So holding each other accountable to that. And then finding allies. So I mentioned this very briefly at the beginning. My role at the IHN means that I'm not actually beholden to WashU or SLU or any of the other institutions I interact with. My paycheck doesn't come from those spaces. And so in some ways I get to act as a little bit more of an ally and a little bit more of a advocate for our students. But I think in institutions, finding those people who can do that and that you can lean into. And then finally, there are mechanisms. So one of the mechanisms, particularly around med schools, is the White Coats for Black Lives is a student group that is a national student group, and it has chapters on many med school campuses. And they actually put out a racial justice report card. That racial justice report card has sort of different areas of grading institutions, and it's published on their website. So like any of you could go to their website, look it up, and see how WashU is graded. For example, they don't grade every med school. It'd be a lot to undertake. But there are some sort of heavy hitters they grade. And the accountability there is that the process for that report card is that they send sort of, here are the things we're going to grade you on. How do you think, like, what are your answers to these things? So like your spaces, are your spaces named after folks who have ties to racism? Maybe something to consider. What are the images? What are the pictures of people in the spaces that students go into? Are they all white folks? Something to consider. Down to like where are your investments, right? Are you divested from particular companies or things like that? So the institution gets to respond. The student group will then go like, well, this is what we found on your website. How do these things match? What are you doing to do this or to address this? And then they sort of send out a final report card, right? So that is transparency, and there's some accountability in that for students to then be able to say like, hey, we'd like you to change these things. This is really important to us. I think it really depends institution by institution. I think about my time at the University of Illinois in the ways that I was able to sort of leverage relationships with administration to get work done. And I think it really is about that relationship piece as well. So then there's a question about, is there a whistleblower protection to report racist systemic impact in healthcare? So broadly speaking, not that I'm aware of. Institutionally, most institutions have some sort of bias reporting mechanism. So there is one that exists within the hospital, Barnes Jewish Hospital. WashU also has one. Many institutions have that. The effectiveness of those is debatable. I have some feelings about these sort of like hotline whistleblower systems. But I think the protection around that also varies institution to institution, depending on where they are in their sort of transformational change. So I don't have a solid answer to that question, but I think it's something really important to think about as we think about what it means to create culture change and what is risked in doing that work. And then there's a question about the removal in 2018 of the sign. What led to its removal? It's actually the work of a lot of advocacy on the part of the diversity, equity, and inclusion office at WashU. There had been some hubbub about it. And ultimately, they wanted it to be sort of like a ceremonial thing, right? Like we're removing the sort of vestige of racism, just sort of quietly removed. And there's still a mark on the wall where it existed. So it's both a great thing and it also has a little bit of bittersweet to that. But ultimately, it was just some advocacy on the part of the office tasked that on campus. So this one says, what medical institutions are you involved with at St. Louis? So WashU and SLU are the two med schools that I work with most closely, although I do some work with the College of Pharmacy and School of Nursing there. And then what are your thoughts on the Del Mar divide? What should be done about it? Man, if I have the answer to that question, I feel like I could retire. So my thoughts on the Del Mar divide is that it is one of the starkest examples I think we have of systemic and structural racism. So for those that are not familiar, there's a street in St. Louis called Del Mar Boulevard. It cuts the city in half. So south of Del Mar is predominantly white folks. And then north of Del Mar are predominantly Black folks. St. Louis is a very Black and white city. Not to say that other ethnicities and races don't exist there. It's just that's the broad demographics. Del Mar is like this sort of unofficial line of wealth, education, and they mentioned race, also housing. And it is the starkest example of where we see disparity happen. I happen to actually live north of Del Mar, and I live 1 block north of Del Mar. And this is a silly example, but I think it sort of speaks to how pervasive this divide is in St. Louis. So the 1 block north of Del Mar, there is a pizza place that is 3 blocks south of me, almost exactly 3 blocks south, less than a mile away from my house. If I order, so it's a chain, if I order from that pizza place, the place that will deliver to me is a place that's north of Del Mar, approximately 3.5 miles from my house. It's not the one that's 3 blocks south of me. It's one that's 3.5 miles north and west of me. Because they don't want people to have to drive north of Del Mar, considered unsafe. Again, this is a silly thing, right? It's not the end of the world if I have to drive to get my pizza, or I will also say that the quality of those 2 pizza places is vastly different as well. But if I have to wait a little bit longer for pizza, it's not a big deal. But it's the sense that there are a lot of commodities that are not available to folks that live north of Del Mar simply because of this sort of line that divides it. What should be done about it is a more challenging question, because ultimately you could say, well, we should invest more north of Del Mar, which is happening, but that leads to gentrification. So it ends up just pushing folks into different ostracized communities. So I think it's much more about really thinking about the reason that the Del Mar divide exists, which is historical redlining, that we often think of as historical redlining, but continues to happen today. And really thinking about how those structures and systems continue to exacerbate an already divided city. So I don't have an answer for that other one, but my thoughts are that when I have to talk about systemic and structural racism, the Del Mar divide gives me a really solid example for how that plays out in really visible ways.
I'm gonna exit out of sharing.
Okay, so we've got some other really great questions. All right, so let me start here. How has your work been received by doctors and faculty at WashU? Ultimately, actually, surprisingly well. We've had a lot of buy-in. I think it's sometimes hard for faculty to understand their role in it. I think they like that I'm there. I think they like that I'm doing the work and they don't have to think so hard about it. And we're pushing them to do that more. So we'll see how that changes the support. What advice do you have for a student pursuing a career in medicine in terms of being anti-racist in their work? What a great question. So I think ultimately understanding the community that you're in and the racialized dynamics that exist in those cities and how your identity impacts that, right? So if you're a person of color, recognizing that the healthcare system is not designed for you, and that does not mean that you do not belong. I think that's a really important thing to think about. Our healthcare system, a lot of people like to say that our healthcare system is broken. I do not think our healthcare system is broken. Our healthcare system is designed to get exactly the outcomes that it gets. Those outcomes are dismal and awful, but that is how our system is designed. So for those folks that are interested in going into medicine, I think recognizing that it isn't by chance that we have the system that we have, that it is very much designed this way. So I think recognizing that and understanding that eventually, perhaps not immediately, not as a student, maybe not even as a resident, you will have power. And that when you have that power, you can make choices about how you wield that power. And you will ultimately have a choice every single time you interact with a patient. That it's not, oh, this is how I do clinical care, that every single patient presents a new set of choices that you get to make. And so I think for me, being very intentional about how I approach every situation and how I think about racism and equity in every single situation I'm in and the choices that I make is probably one of the best ways to think about what it means to be anti-racist as a physician. Race is one factor that impacts people in healthcare. How do you advocate or educate for protecting, advancing care for LGBTQ and transgender adults? So phenomenal. So in our health equity and justice curriculum, we have an explicit anti-racism thread. And we do that about, it's woven into a lot of different areas, but we have sort of explicit sessions, say 7 or 8 times over the course of the year, where we're really like diving deep into sort of systemic racism. The rest of the time, we're talking about social structural determinants of health. We're talking about other identities. And we talk a lot about intersectionality. And so when we do equity work in our curriculum, we pay a lot of attention to language, excuse me, sorry, and making sure that our language is inclusive and really thinking about all of the groups that are minoritized in medicine. So that includes our LGBTQ population, folks that are experiencing poverty, our folks that are religious minorities, et cetera, and how does our language reflect the way that we care for them. And so we do some explicit sessions around what is gender affirming care, not like outside of like hormone treatment, but like what does it mean to affirm gender in like everyday clinical practice? And also thinking a lot about the ways that we construct spaces and we communicate signposts in our spaces. So it's less explicit. There are explicit sessions. It's less explicit than our anti-racism curriculum, but it certainly is there. We're very mindful of multiple identities. How could you envision some of these same strategies or approaches working in teacher education? As there can be a similar dynamic at play with white teachers teaching students of color. Yes. So I think a lot of the same things can be employed. There's a similar dynamic in social work, right? So I come from a social work background. Social work is a lot of white ladies working in communities of color, being gatekeepers in communities of color. I think of teaching in similar sort of way, right? A lot of white teachers being gatekeepers to education and knowledge. And so I think very similarly having conversations about, the history of education, where has education historically been removed from communities of color or defunded in communities of color, where has education reinforced, right? I'm like in my head, I'm like really mindful of this headline that just happened, this video that got released of the teacher sort of mocking indigenous cultures, right? Like how do we start to be very intentional about that kind of work and recognizing like teachers have a lot of power in classroom spaces, and what personal and professional formation do we need to be doing in education? So I think, I could imagine in sort of education courses having a similar kind of what does anti-racism in education look like, right? Having the same kind of structure. So I think it could actually probably mirror almost exactly what we're doing in healthcare. What community needs have been identified in St. Louis from the community perspective? Such a good question. So behavioral health is a major sort of vacuum in St. Louis, and there's a lot that's been identified from community around that. Investment is another major issue where we have a lot of blighted neighborhoods or vacant housing. And then education, going off of what we just talked about. St. Louis has a really poor education system. It's a really complicated education system. And so there's been a lot of needs articulated around needing to sort of level those playing fields for folks. And then how do we reduce implicit bias in physician decision-making and in healthcare education? I think it's the same way that we reduce implicit bias everywhere, and that's by shedding light on implicit bias, making it something that we talk about often, and normalizing those conversations. I tell our students all the time, we all have bias. Bias is not something that you're ever going to get rid of. And really we're looking at mitigation strategies, right? Bias isn't something that like park outside the door. We always say like, leave your bias at the door. That's not a thing. We don't drop our biased luggage off, walk in, do our clinical interaction, and then walk out and pick it back up, right? It comes into the room with us. We can reduce the way that it actually has impacts, right? So we think about how bias leads to prejudice, leads to stereotyping, leads to discrimination. If we can stop it at bias, right? If that cannot lead to prejudice, or even stop it at prejudice, right? That we don't allow it to impact stereotyping, we don't allow it to impact discrimination, by being very mindful of like, oh, I just had this thought. Why did I have this thought? What does that mean? Where did that come from? That then allows you to act in a way that's different than you might if you were working through some sort of muscle memory. And so I think normalizing those conversations and really being intentional about them. something that I think a lot about is language and the words we use, right? We have a lot of colloquial phrases that are rooted in implicit bias and in a fundamental misunderstanding of particular groups of people. One that's been coming up a lot for us is as we think about people buying in, you might hear the phrase drinking the Kool-Aid, right? Now that's rooted in this like suicidal event, right? We think about mental health, right? What does it mean to drink the Kool-Aid? And how are we just mindful of these things? Now, I don't want to be the language police. It's not my job to tone police anybody, but it is important for me to think about, if I'm using that language, what other things am I conveying as I'm talking? How am I mindful of the ways and the words that I'm speaking? So bringing those things out, not allowing them to remain hidden, not sort of creating shame around them. Shame doesn't help us do anything. Shame and guilt are utterly unproductive. So if we can start to remove that from conversations around bias, I think that ultimately helps us make better decisions in the long run. One more question. Okay, so there's two questions here. Did licensing state offices take complaints anonymously for med facilities and med personnel? I am not sure about that. I don't have an answer to that. That is probably something good to look into. I would imagine that there is some sort of complaint around institutions. And then are racist attitudes ingrained in occupational medicine as well? Yes. So I actually do a lot of work with physical therapy, occupational therapy, all of those things sort of come from the same structure of healthcare, right? Rooted in our economic system and the way that healthcare gets doled out. So certainly those attitudes are pervasive in every branch of medicine, as far as I know. Which is why it's really important that when we do this, we really think upstream and we think about how our policies and systems and structures are begetting the same results over and over again. How are we getting the same people into these systems? And what does it mean for us to shake it up?
Thank you again to our speaker, Caitlin, and for all of you for attending this week. We hope to see you next week with Catherine Shi from Advancing Justice Chicago. And we also want to bring your attention to the QR code that's on your seat. If you scan that with your phone, you can fill out an evaluation of this lecture and then also share a little bit about yourselves with us as well. We super appreciate that feedback, but have a great rest of your week. Thank you.